Hello, I'm Meri Fatin. Welcome to Cover to Cover. Presented by Writing WA, the show is our opportunity to hear more from a West Australian author about their latest work. My guest today is Michelle Michau-Crawford to talk about her first published work, Leaving Elvis and Other Stories. Thanks for being here, Michelle.
Thank you, Meri.
Now, Leaving Elvis is the 12th of 13 stories in this book, but it is the hinge around which everything is built. When someone asks you off the cuff to describe this book, how do you go about it?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one. We decided that the best way to describe this book, in simple terms, is to describe it as a volume of closely linked short stories. That's it in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. That's the short answer anyway.
Now, look, I want to begin by understanding the origins of Leaving Elvis in its own right, because you started work on it in 2005 and it only became something that you were happy with, well, 8 or 9 years later.
Yes, I wrote a story, I can't even remember what it was called, that had some of the elements of the Leaving Elvis story in it. It had, without going to specifics for people who haven't read it, but it didn't feel quite finished. It started off, it was actually a very long short story that was not long enough to be a novella, but too long to be a short story, and I couldn't find a home for it. I finished the story and actually submitted it for a honours project as part of an honours project, and then I put it away for a while. But I always had the sense that it wasn't finished, and always had the idea that I wanted to do something more with it. When I finished all my studies and I went back and did postgraduate studies, and I decided that was something I wanted to work on afterwards for myself. So in the years I was doing postgraduate work, I did tinker with it on and off over 4 or 5 years, and I actually sent off twice for submission and had it rejected, which was wonderful actually, because one of them was a really good rejection.
What do you mean by that?
I sent it off to a journal and I got onto the shortlist for this particular journal, and Kate Kennedy, the writer, was editing, a guest editor for the journal, and she ultimately had the final word, and she said no, but she offered me some suggestions on how she thought the story could be improved, and I got a bit huffy, as you do, because I was still quite, and then I went back to it and I thought, yeah, actually she was onto something there. So I took some of her advice on board and tinkered with it again. Some of her advice didn't sit with me, but it was great experience to sort of sit there and go through it and discard and accept some of the ideas. And then I submitted it again somewhere else, and it was rejected again, and I just put it away and thought, okay, you've had, fair run. But it never left me, and
in 2013 it won the Australian Book Review's Elizabeth Joly Short Story Prize, and what I find really interesting about that story was the fact that what the impetus was actually for you sending it off in the first place.
Yes, well I was, but at that time, from the time I'd started writing it, when it was part of an honours project, I'd gone back to do my doctorate, and I was teaching in the university, doing sessional teaching in the university, and I guess I'd lost a lot of my passion for writing. It had, although I loved it, and I still consider myself a writer, but I hadn't really had much to show for it for a long time.
I lost confidence?
I'd lost confidence, yeah. But I was standing in a classroom of undergraduate students, and some of these students were really very interested in writing and wanted to know, what they could do to push themselves and be part of a writing community. And I suggested that some of them perhaps start submitting work, looking selectively for competitions and short stories and, places to submit their stories and their poetry and whatever. And as I was standing there, I told them about the Australian Book Review Elizabeth Joly Prize, and I said, now this is the prize that you want to be entering if you really believe that you've got a great story, because this is the prize in Australia. And I had this moment where I realised that I was telling them, all about being a writer, but I had not written or submitted anything for ages, and I had lost my confidence, my passion, and I decided there and then, I can still remember that moment of standing there in front of this classroom of students looking at me thinking, you're a fake, you're a phony, you're telling these people something you don't even believe in anymore. So I decided that I would go back to this story because I didn't really believe that I was done with it. I just wasn't able to let it go.
So you knew the story you were going back to?
I knew I was going back to that story, and I thought, if I can't make this story work, then I'll go and do something else. I'll go and, I don't know, work in a shop or anything, you know. But at least I've given it a go. So in between teaching classes, it was a really heavy teaching load that year, and marking assignments and meeting with students and all of that. Every spare moment I got, I was working on my story that by now had been named Leaving Elvis, and there was all of this external stuff going on. There was the Gillard era, and you know, all the stuff that made its way into the story towards the end of that particular story. So about 2 days before the submission date closed for that particular competition, I just kind of went, it's done. And I had this moment where I thought, oh, I loved that. This is what I lost over the last perhaps nearly 10 years, I suppose, of working towards, you know, actually what had happened was, when I think about it, I had been working, enjoying my writing, and had some minor successes, and I thought, oh, I need to go and learn how to write.
I thought you still didn't know.
I thought, yeah, all right, I've had some minor successes, so now I really need to go and learn to write. And I took it all far too seriously.
But you were also hell-bent on writing the novel, weren't you?
Yeah.
You didn't give yourself permission to write short stories.
I had to, and there was a number of reasons for that. Around the time I started writing short stories, I had got my passion for writing through reading short stories, particularly Western Australian short stories in the late 80s to probably early 2000s. I was reading a lot of West Australian writers and Australian writers with short stories. And I loved the way that people like Joan London and Gail Jones and all sorts of people had written a short story collection. Deborah Robertson was another one. Written a short story collection first and then got on to write novels. But I'd sort of missed the boat. I wasn't ready to be submitting work at that time. I was reading it. I was learning through reading, I think. And so by the time I decided I wanted to publish short stories were, you know, they weren't fashionable anymore. Nobody wanted to publish short stories. In fact, I've got a few rejections from people telling me that they liked my work, that stuff I was sending out for fellowships and mentorships and things like that for short stories. But they were saying, but short stories just don't sell.
But then you went to a writer's retreat, didn't you, in the Blue Mountains, which is where you sort of finally got your permission back to write those short stories. Yeah,
well, I think the permission came because I had won, literally the day before going to the retreat, I had won the Elizabeth Jolley Short Story Prize. So I was on a high. I arrived there with champagne, and you know, I was, woohoo, I've arrived. Yeah. No red carpet, but never mind. You know.
There should have been.
But when I arrived with the novel, that was the work I took with me. And I would sit around the dinner table at night time, because we didn't, this was at Varuna, and during the day we were all working on our various projects, and at night we'd talk, and I would be talking about, oh, I've got to finish this novel because I want to get on with the short stories. I have to finish this novel. Carry on. And I sort of had some conversations that said, well, why aren't you writing the short stories that you want to be writing? And I said, I have to finish the novel. It was this ridiculous task I had set myself to prove that, that I was a real writer, yes, because there was that, it was driven from within myself, of course, yeah.
So from winning the prize then, how did you develop the idea of the stories that would be around Leaving Elvis as being even associated in any way?
Originally, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I knew that this world that I had sort of developed over all of these years was that Leaving Elvis short story spans, you know, well, it spans a fairly short period, but it harks back to 30 years of life. And so in order to get that 30 years of authentic, sort of believable family life and experience, I had already sort of come to know these people, even those, you know, there might have been a couple of sentences mentioned throughout the whole story, but I kind of knew these people, and I didn't feel ready to let them go, but I was always fairly certain I didn't want to go and turn it into a traditional novel. I did think about it. I thought at one point, you know, it might be the best way to go. But I wanted to stick with the short stories. Once I'd won a short story prize, I felt, all right, now you are validated to go and write stories, because, you know, that's what you do at the moment anyway. Yeah, don't look back. You don't need to go to the novel. I didn't necessarily want the stories to be as linked at the beginning as they have turned out to be. I had the idea of a more tenuous link where there would be maybe a thread that would run through the stories. And I thought it might be this town that I had sort of invented might be the connection. But as the stories developed, and I started to move away from that town for some of the stories, and went too far off a tangent, and I realised that that starting point, that family in that first story, the Leaving Elvis story, was what I wanted to be my focus. And I just started to develop with that focus in mind and discarded some of the other ones.
So the story goes across 3 generations of that family. But I think sometimes when we see, you know, the finally edited finished product, we forget about everything else that must have been thrown into the mix to finally come to this. And I'm quite interested in how many other stories you wrote and had to eventually ditch, or, you know, the kill your darlings kind of thing, to come to what we have with 13 stories here.
There were quite a few actually that I wrote, but I wouldn't say I got them all to polished, complete standard. But when I was working, I started off trying to finish one story at a time, although I might be working on 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 when I was really...
Wow.
So, you know, because as I'd be writing one story, an idea would sort of spring up, and I would sort of put down notes, and then before you know it, there would a draft for another story, and then from that story there'd be something else. I had all these files and papers, and it was all quite crazy. Chaotic, very chaotic. I think there were probably 4 that I really did like, that were close to finish, like good enough as in terms of fairly well polished drafts that had to go because they just didn't fit. One was told from Leslie, the boyfriend friend in the Leaving Elvis story, and I really got very attached to him, so it was quite sad to let him go. And
it does sound like a lot to let go. Are they permanently let go, do you think, or is there a potential future for them?
It's an interesting place to be in. So many people have said to me, "Oh, you've got to write, and what next?" And I've said, "Well, why do I have to write one next?" I like the gaps, and I like the questions and the unfinished business. But by the same token, I am, you know, there are little bits and pieces I'd like to explore further. There was a story I set that just didn't work. It was going back too far to the First World War in France. It was a story dealing with Len, the grandfather in the stories, his father. But I let that one go, but I'm not sure that I
Something could germinate from it.
I've been tinkering, not with him. I've made a conscious effort not to bring him in, or bring him in as somebody else. You know?
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's a tough one. I don't really want to go Leaving Elvis Part 2.
Yeah,
I'd like to do something else. But there's potential for them to come back in some other way.
I guess you were talking about the chaos of kind of writing stories concurrently and leaping from one to the other, and I'm quite interested in how, in writing one story, you potentially had to change something in another story to make it all work. Was that a constant?
Once the stories, once I started to get a form and start to feel that instead of looking at them as individual stories, which is what I was wanting to write, individual stories, but once they started to feel cohesive and I started to refer to them mentally as my book, it became really tricky and chaotic. I tried using big scraps of butcher's paper. I tried to map all the connections. I tried software programs. I tried preset and timeline, all sorts of different things that people suggested to me, because what would happen, I'd be working away on a story and one little detail would come in. It might be just, you know, some tiny detail about something that happened externally to the content of the story. For example, there was one story in there that I totally missed where I had made reference to JFK. But then by the time I had to rework the story to make all the bits fit with other stories, JFK wasn't even on the scene, and it was sort of things like that I had to keep constantly checking and rechecking, and then remembering some of my characters changed names for various reasons, so I'd have to make sure that they were going by the name later that they had decided that they wanted to be referred to as, and all those little things. It was quite chaotic, and there was a point where I went, I should just write a novel, as if, you know, my just writing a novel hasn't been particularly successful so far. It hasn't culminated in a published novel. So, but it seemed to me that this couldn't be any harder. And I suppose that was my little defensive thing too, because there is that perception by some people that writing a short story is easier. So I was sort of thinking, well, I'll just write a novel. You know, this.
And I've reflected on the fact that the what happens in this collection of short stories is looking at, and you've done this deliberately, I'm sure, the impact of an event on generations of a family. So, do you just sit and think about these things, or you know, do you ponder?
I've always been quite a morbid little soul. No, I do. And of course I draw from my own experiences. But yeah, I do ponder that sort of thing. Like, where does it start? You know, an incident, it has this flow-on effect. You know, nothing happens in isolation. So an event that sort of affects me is going to affect everybody I encounter in life at some way or another. You know,
the untimely arrival of a human being.
Exactly. So everything has a flow-on effect. But and then the way people react or respond or deal with or not deal with things depends on what they've experienced in their life. So it's everything's sort of connected, and I'm very interested in that sort of thread, I suppose.
One of the things that I loved through these books was your grasp of Australianness, you know, kind of country Australianness and the Aussie vernacular. And there was one particular paragraph that I read it to myself quite a few times, just because to me it just encapsulated everything, and I'm hoping that you'll read it for us now. Page 45, I believe, is where you'll find it.
All right. And it's actually quite difficult for me to read like this because I try not to sound too Australian. So
you can sound Australian as you like.
Okay, it starts. The back screen door bangs shut after them. He drags himself out of bed, stretches the cricks out of his legs and back and gets washed up. Puts on his good strides, digs out the kid's favourite shirt, the one her gran wrapped up for her to give him for Christmas back when she was 5. Gives himself a good talking to. Plenty of blokes had a worse run than him and got through without succumbing to plonk to numb the pain. His old man would be ashamed if he were here. Teetotaler all his life, mad as a cut snake, but seemed as fit as a proverbial Mallee bull, right until the end.
Yeah. There's so much of that in the book. Thank you for reading that. So much of that really deep, I've used the term vernacular before, but I've wondered at times whether it's dying out, you know, where you can still hear people talking like that. So I love the fact that you've preserved it in this book. How did you know, where were you drawing that from? Your own personal experience?
I think I was drawing it from personal experience. I spent 15 years living in the Pilbara in a mining town where there was a lot of Aussie vernacular going there.
Yes, it's alive and well.
How's it going, mate? It was very much alive and well. And I also spent a lot of my life in small country towns, and I come from a sort of working class background where it was very sort of that sort of language was used and the way of speaking. So I guess it was just that culmination of all of those things. But I think probably the most recent, though, of course, would be the 15 years in the Pilbara, because that was very,
That, and as you say, combined with the childhood where you were moving from, you know, small country towns, small country town to small country town, the other element of this, which I think is somewhat Australian as well, is that sense of physical isolation and the sense of mental isolation that comes with that maybe Australians sometimes don't even recognise in themselves. And I noticed that particularly in the female characters, that they were quite, there was an emotional barrier often with them. Did you see that in them too?
Yes, I did. And that was the thing I was using. I guess that was something when I created the first character, Louise, that I was conscious of that, and I wanted to put that in there. The idea of her feeling outside and self-protective and cut off a little bit to a certain extent, and not able to or trusting enough to let people in.
Which would be such a handicap in small communities.
Yeah, but it's also a self-protection, I think, in small communities to a certain degree, from my experience anyway, and from people I've spoken to. But being young, it's probably not helpful for the children, at least. But they don't tend to perhaps experience it as much. They tend to go. You can go to a new school and have a new best friend by the end of the day when you're very young, but that gets harder as you get older, of course. But I think for adults, of course, and you're in a small town, and in small towns, I've got very mixed feelings about them, because when my small town experience in the Pilbara, it was a wonderful experience on so many levels, but it was also a very I did feel outside for a long time, going into a town where, and of course afterwards I discovered that a lot of people felt that way. You go in with this assumption that everyone knows everyone and everyone's got their place and you've got to find your place, but you're not sporty, or you're not, you're not into partying, or you're not into whatever. So finding your place can be quite tricky, I suppose. Yeah.
What did come out of that experience, though, was your early learning around literature, which was remarkably self-driven. Yeah,
I suspect I wouldn't have been able to follow my dream to write if I hadn't have had that experience of going away, living in the Pilbara, and being not forced because it was a choice, but sort of being in a position where there wasn't a possibility of childcare for me, so I was a stay-at-home mum. Therefore, I discovered the library, and we had a wonderful library at that time, and a fabulous librarian who used to help me. Once I'd read all these books on the shelves that were of interest to me, she would get books up from Perth and other, WA libraries for me, and get up all the new stuff from, say, Fremantle Press, for example, when they publish new stuff. And I learnt to read and read widely, and got my focus through reading Australian writers. It was, in a sense, trying to find my own place in Australia. I'd moved so much, I didn't really feel particularly connected to any place. So by reading lots of diverse Australian, particularly women's, although some of the men, such as Kim Scott and the early Tim Winton, had a great impact on me as well. But reading the contemporary women, particularly of the 90s and 80s, and realising that they too, in their writing at least, were feeling isolation and this struggle against, about their own position in the land. And I kind of realised, well, actually, maybe there is a place for me and one more voice.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to me. I'm hearing you say now that it was you who drove the reading of the Australian and the West Australian literature. There wasn't the librarian kind of pointing you in that direction. That was your attraction to that. And it extends beyond that too, doesn't it? Into film and other Australian kind of...
I used in film. Yeah, I can remember the olden days of videotapes, video shops. I don't even know if they exist anymore.
Hardly.
There used to be video shops. Video sort of became quite popular in that time, and we had a drive-in theatre that used to get very old, outdated movies that played forever. And then that closed down, and everyone got into the videos. And I was lucky enough to find a fairly progressive for the town video store. That would get me up the short films from short film festivals and things. So again, it's tapping into that short stories and Australian film. So yeah, there was a love of all things. And the television, I mean, we didn't have the television at all for our first couple of years up there, only because we never got around to getting the fancy aerial. And then when we did, we had only the ABC, and we pretty much, watched the ABC for... So that was heavily Australian content then.
Yeah, so you essentially gave yourself an apprenticeship long before you actually went into formal academic study around literature, this lengthy apprenticeship in Australian literature.
Yeah, I did without realising. And then I had started writing without any formal training and had some successes. I got a shortlisting in a national undergraduates writing competition, and I got a mentorship with the Australian Society of Authors, where I worked with Luke Davies. But then I got frightened and thought, now you need to go and learn. So I started to study. So that, of course, it was a good and not so good sides of it. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it all helped.
I love the way this conversation leads to the bit of Cover to Cover where I ask you to recommend a West Australian author, because it must have been a particularly fraught process for you. Tell me about the process, because I know you did some serious thinking.
I had to do some very serious thinking, because what I did initially was go to my bookshelves and start pulling out, yes, for this reason, that reason. And I thought, no, I've got to have some parameters here. So I decided to start with, initially I would cut anyone who's already been mentioned on this program, whether as a recommended book or as a guest, so they were out for no reason other than they've had a mention. Then I decided to cut everything that wasn't fiction, because I had on my pile poetry and some memoir and all sorts of, so that was gone. Then I decided it had to be 5-year limit.
As in written within the last 5 years?
Written within the last 5 years. And then I thought, ideally, because this is my first book, it should be a first book. So anyway, I've come to, after much deliberation, come to recommend, and of this one, I only realised after I chose this book, also came out from a prize. This is Yvette Walker's lovely book, Letters to the End of Love. This book came from, after a long process, from a short story prize she won in HQ magazine, and eventually became this book. So I decided to go with this one for a number of reasons. For one, it's an absolutely fabulous, beautiful book. It's completely different to mine. Mm-hmm. It's, as the title might suggest, Letters to the End of Love. It's got 3 different threads running through it, love letters between partners, and it covers a number of historical periods and continents. It's Australian in the way that my Australian book is not Australian, because it covers some Russian history and the Nazi period is covered. It's like this beautiful meditation on love and art and grief and loss, and it's just a really, it's like reading a modernist novel. It's not at all like your stereotypical contemporary fiction. It resonates a little bit like Virginia Woolf. When you read something Virginia Woolf writes, and you have to put the book down and go away and think about
Absorb it.
And just take it in and then come back and read it again and then keep going. It's that sort of book. And it's
that's
just
beautiful recommendation. Yeah. Michelle, speaking of beautiful books, congratulations on Leaving Elvis and Other Stories. It's so insightful and resonant. I absolutely loved reading it, and I know other readers will too. And thank you so much for joining me on Cover to Cover today.
Thank you, Meri. It's been a pleasure.
Writing WA has created book club notes for Leaving Elvis and all the other books we've featured on the show. You can download them from the For Readers section of our website. You can also subscribe to our book club e-newsletter to receive the notes direct to your inbox each month. We know that many of you don't have a local bookshop where you can buy the books featured on the show, so we've made an arrangement with Crow Books in Perth. When you order our featured books from Crow by phone, mention the code Cover to Cover and you'll get the postage free. Next month on Cover to Cover, I'll meet Yasmin Abdel-Majid. At only 16, Yasmin founded an organisation to help young people create positive change in their communities. At 21, she was working on a remote Australian oil and gas rig where she was the only woman, and certainly the only Muslim woman, of Sudanese, Egyptian, Australian background. We'll discuss her memoir, Yasmin's Story, Who Do You Think I Am? We really appreciate you getting in touch with your feedback about Cover to Cover. You can contact Writing WA via the email address shown on the screen. Thanks for joining me again this month. We hope you're enjoying meeting West Australian authors and hearing about their great new books. See you next time, and enjoy reading local.